Hey everyone. So we are starting today, chapter 20. You can see the title here is The History of Life. So if you see in the image, we're going to look at a little bit similar to what you did in 8th grade and talk about some of the fossils that represent how we understand, where different living things originated and what that tells us about changes that have occurred on the earth. Okay, so as always, get the title for me, and then we're going to go through section 20.1. So that's called the fossil record. And you can see in this picture, we're looking at an example of a fossil, which would be an imprint of what looks like maybe a dinosaur foot or something of the like. And you can see there's a smaller indentation over here also. So these are certainly different types, or these are certainly one type of fossil, and there are many, many different types that we're going to be looking at here. But what they all share in common is that they all provide evidence for scientists about what Earth was like back, billions of years ago, and how that Earth has changed over time. So when we look at these objectives here, we're going to talk about what fossils can teach us about ancient life. We're going to look at how we date Earth's history, so meaning how we identify and assign time periods to certain fossils or rock types. We're going to look at the geologic time scale and its divisions. And then we're going to also talk about how the physical and biological processes that have been occurring on the earth have shaped our environments. Okay. And that includes, what humans do right now to our environment as well. So fossils give us information, of course, about things that are no longer here. They could provide information about things that are here if, their descendants are still kind of hanging around, but are probably, again, modified in some way. Fossils take a very long time to form for the most part, especially if we're talking about a fossil that's embedded in rock. All right, so we can talk about these in the context of several different types. There are what we call body fossils, trace fossils, and then mold fossils. And the difference would be body fossils are remnants of what was actually present in that organism. And that includes what you see here, bones, teeth, shells, or claws. In general, soft tissue gets broken down when an individual dies. But these harder tissues made of things like calcium and other kind of tougher elements are going to remain for the most part. So they tend to kind of stay around. And so these are fossils that we can obtain, and that gives us a lot of indication and evidence for certain claims about, what maybe existed in these species in the past. Trace fossils are those imprints. So like what we saw back a few slides ago. These are footsteps. These are markings of tails and arms and hands, or whatever you want to call them, different limbs. It can show us burrows and nests and egg shape and egg size and quantity and all sorts of different unique kind of characteristics like that. And then the mold fossil is an impression, let me move myself up here, of an organism into the surface around it. So in other words, as if that thing was present and then it kind of got compressed over a long period of time, the individual breaks down, but what remains is, the rock around it, which has then kind of absorbed that imprint. So we can look at mollusks here, which would be equivalent to snails and clams, and then fern leaves here. So we can see very, very large fossils. We can see very small fossils. Sometimes we're looking at single grains of pollen. Sometimes we're looking at entire dinosaurs, right? They can be, again, fragments, and they can be the entire piece of that particular appendage, maybe. But sometimes those trace fossils are all that we get to work with, right? So tracks and burrows and that kind of stuff, okay? Most fossils we see are preserved in sedimentary rocks, and those sedimentary rocks are important in how they form because that determines how these things get preserved. You've also, if you've seen Jurassic Park, or at least maybe the original Jurassic Park, you know that whole story stems from this finding of mosquitoes in amber, right? And so sometimes we find small organisms like that could be preserved in things like amber as well. So when we talk about fossils in sedimentary rock, several processes result in their being present in that place. So when we think about the formation of this, In general, water kind of touches all places of the earth, but certainly in larger bodies of water, we can see this happening. But even if we're talking about a place that's maybe pretty landlocked, but we have, rivers and creeks, if there's a dead organism there, that dead organism can carry particles of maybe that decaying body, or even smaller things like grains of pollen into a larger body of water. And in that larger body of water, what we end up seeing is over time, those dead organisms can be buried by additional layers of sediment. And that sediment comes from clay and lime and other kind of minerals and particles that over time just build up, right? They kind of come out of the water, they diffuse out, and they accumulate at the bottom of the riverbed or the ocean bed or whatever it is. And so over time, that accumulating sediment starts to continue to bury and bury and bury. Over time, those preserved remains kind of get pushed further and further down, and it accumulates more and more pressure, which over time can create these imprints and trace fossils, and even, fossils involving teeth and bones and other parts of that formerly living thing. So the sedimentary rocks are what we tend to focus on when we talk about the use of fossils. So in thinking about that, in order to understand exactly how old some of these fossils are, we have to use dating practices. And what we mean by that is there are two different types of dating. We can use what we call relative dating, or we can use radioactive dating. And the difference would be one of them uses radiation. That would be your radioactive dating. Relative dating, on the other hand, is more of just an estimate. So it's not as precise as radioactive dating would be, but relative dating is going to give us kind of an indication about, maybe what era or period a specific organism was present in. So when we think about relative dating, again, if we're using sedimentary rock, the underlying principle is that the younger rock layers are going to be at the top. The ones that existed a long, long time ago are going to be closer or further down, okay, underneath that sediment. So the lower the layer, the older the fossil would be in that position. The higher up the fossil, the younger the rock, the more recently that living thing was found here on the earth. So when we do relative dating, our goal is to place rock layers and fossils in a temporal sequence. And what that means, temporal, remember, refers to timing. So it's based on time periods, all right? And it's kind of like an estimate based on, what other fossils do we find in similar layers of rock, in similar positions, similar locations, or even in different parts of the world. And when we think about it in that context, we can use these things called index fossils to help us establish and compare other fossils in other parts. So index fossils are these distinctive and unique fossils that are specific to one layer of rock, I should say, or one time period, as an example. And if we can find those examples of index fossils in multiple places, well, even if all of those same fossils that we're kind of dealing with and trying to estimate the ages for of other living things in those places, even though they may not all be in the same areas, if we have index fossils in all of those areas, we can estimate the ages of other things by using those index fossils, okay? So let's look at an example of that. So here we have 3 locations. We could assume that they're probably pretty far apart. However, we can see that also they contain really kind of a variety of fossils. But one certainly remains true in that it's found in every single location, and that is right here, fossil D. So fossil D is found here, second to bottom layer of location 1. Here, the bottommost layer of location 2, and here, second to bottom of location 3. So what that tells us is that because these are all found here, well, these guys probably all existed, up here. These guys all probably existed around the same time, which tells us that probably our youngest fossil in this whole diagram would be these up here, right? They're in the uppermost layer of both of these 2 locations. And the oldest ones are going to be these guys down here because they're in the lowest position of all of them. But even if we have a scenario with just one of a totally different type, we could say that the fact that it's below fossil D and above fossil F would give us an indication that it existed as a species somewhere in between those 2 time periods, right? And so that helps us to kind of identify how long ago were these things present, and how might we estimate that in terms of millions or even billions of years. Now, in contrast to that, I mentioned there's another type of dating that we can use, and this provides more precise mathematical types of measurements. And this is called radiometric dating. So, relative dating, again, is going to give us no information about a fossil's actual age in years. It's simply an estimation. When we do radiometric dating, we're using the presence of radioactive isotopes to help identify exactly how old something is. And by exactly, I mean probably in the order of, a few thousand years within that window of time, depending upon which type of isotope we're using. So what this relies upon is this understanding that for different elements, we have different variations of the atoms that we find. So for example, carbon is an element that has 6 protons and 6 neutrons and 6 electrons. That's something that our periodic table tells us would be true. Now, what I also know about carbon is that carbon has some alternative versions of itself where it can have more than 6 neutrons, and sometimes it has 8 neutrons. And that type of carbon is called a carbon isotope. We call it carbon 14 because it has 14 atomic mass units, which is your protons plus your neutrons. Now, without getting into too much detail about that, what that essentially means is that this is still an atom that acts like carbon. It's still an atom that, for our cells is still going to function like carbon would and make up CO2 and methane and all sorts of other molecules. But what that means is that this is slightly radioactive. We know that radioactive things are radioactive because over time they lose some of those particles. And so they give off a little bit of radiation, and carbon 14 is one of those examples, and they do so on the order of what we call a half-life. So half-life is the amount of time required for those atoms to decay and lose those additional neutrons in this case. All right. So in order to date a fossil or a rock, we have to use a proportion of radioactive, or in this case, carbon 14 atoms, to stable atoms, which in this case is carbon 12, to calculate the age of a sample. So different isotopes, depending upon which element they belong to, have different half-lives. And what you see here in this table at the bottom are examples of radioactive isotopes and the half-life of those elements and those atoms. And so some of these are used to date fossils that we believe to be fairly young and existing not too far in the past, like on the order of just 100 to 30,000 years. Carbon 14 would be that. Others that have longer half-lives, like potassium and uranium, would be used to date things that are on the billions of years kind of scale. And so, again, this requires some serious testing if we're going to go about kind of doing this process. But what we see is something like this. So over time, we know potassium 40 as an example, which again can be used to date things up to almost 5 billion years old. We see half-lives on the order of about 1.2 billion here for the first half-life, and then going upwards to almost 2.5 for the next half-life, and so on. So when we talk about this, okay, this kind of progression, again, we're monitoring the amount of potassium 40 that would be present in something like a fossil at a specific time period. So really what geologists tend to use is a combination of relative dating and radiometric dating, because it's just not possible to radiometrically date every type of fossil we find. But if we have an understanding of some things, like those index fossils we talked about, we can use that information to apply it to new fossils found in similar situations, okay? So when we look at this thing, so this here is called my geologic timescale. Geologic timescale is going to represent the time periods in the past when certain events occurred or when certain individuals were alive. And so you've probably heard of many of these things, like the Cenozoic period or the Cenozoic era, the Mesozoic, and the Paleozoic. And those are still in terms of Earth's history, these are fairly recent in our past. You can go back even further beyond that, and look beyond this 570 millions of years. And I'll show you that here on the next slide. And that's where we get to talk about things called eras and eons. So in general, when we look at our geologic time scale, these periods are defined kind of arbitrarily by scientists according to, unique individuals that are surviving, unique events that are occurring, right? Um, um, heat waves and ice ages and all those things fall into this. So we use a lot of information to identify this scale and to define what goes where. As it mentioned on the last slide, eons are kind of the broadest category, and those get divided into eras, and then those eras get divided into periods. And all of these things are named based on either organisms that were present at the time or something else that was happening. But yeah, they have pretty complicated names in this case. So we are currently in the Cenozoic era, and in the Quaternary period, which started about 1.8 million years ago. But there are other, things that you've heard here, like the Jurassic period and the Cretaceous period and the Triassic and Permian and Carboniferous. Those are all probably terms that you've heard of in the past. And then going down from that, even pre-Paleozoic era, we have Precambrian time, millions and millions of years ago, on the order of billions in this case, 4.6 to 4 billion, which is really going to be the first living things. And at this point, we don't have a lot of information in terms of, what periods existed from them, because we don't have tons of fossils that are accessible. But from a geologist standpoint, it appears that, Earth's living things began to kind of start surviving and thriving about 4.6 billion years ago. So I really like this graphic. I think this is a great way of thinking about Earth's history in the form of like a clock. And one of the assignments I had you do was to watch that video where we were talking about, how many seconds in this it's actually taken for humans to finally develop, and how long we've actually been present, because we tend to focus a lot on ourselves, but in reality the earth has been here for a whole lot longer, and lots of living things have lived here before we developed. So if we have the formation of the earth as a whole planet, right, it takes about 5.5 hours in a 24-hour period to have formed the first living cells. So that's, again, like, several billions of years here. From 5:30 to 8, that's when cells develop the ability to produce their own food. So we're talking about photosynthesis developing here around 8 a.m. If you continue on, we get eukaryotic cells here. Remember, cells that have membrane-bound organelles and are more complicated than prokaryotes. Multicellular animals here. Chordates, which are animals that have backbones. Land plants, tetrapods, things that walk on all fours. Dinosaurs, mammals, warm-blooded animals with hair and fur, flowering plants. Dinosaurs go extinct, humans come into being, and now we are where we are. So if this is on the scale of a 24-hour period, or I'm sorry, I guess, yeah, a 12-hour period in this case, it looks like. But we're dealing with, no, I'm misspeaking again. 24-hour period in this case. We're dealing with a significant number of events happening really here. The most information we know is in this last kind of quarter of this diagram. And so a lot of things are happening here, but certainly there was a lot of other stuff that built up to that. And we're just still to the point where we're trying to identify what those things were. So the last couple things we need to talk about is what this means in terms of the planet, right? We can radioactively date fossils, and we can look at geologic time and identify eras and periods and all that. But one thing we want to recognize is how all this kind of came into being. And so when we think about the Earth, we know that the changes that have happened in the living things on Earth have been due to a number of different things. So the environment has undergone changes. Climate has changed significantly. We've had ice ages and heat waves, and you can see here a heat wave as identified by this is only 6 to 12 degrees higher on average worldwide, which doesn't seem super significant. But consider then that an ice age is a global temperature that was only about 5 degrees Celsius cooler on average, and that created a whole ice age across the world. So even a few degrees Celsius, like we've talked about before and earlier in the year, makes a really big difference in terms of our environments and our climates. In addition to that, we know that the Earth has also changed geologically in terms of things like the shifting of our tectonic plates. So when tectonic plates crash into each other, you can get mountains that are built. You can get subduction where one goes underneath, right? You can have all sorts of different geological features, volcanic eruptions, things like that, that form as these tectonic plates are moving and shifting and grinding and sliding and doing all sorts of things. So we've created islands, not we, but the Earth has created islands through this process. And those are mostly volcanic in this case, the Galapagos that we talked about with evolution, and then the Hawaiian Islands here. In addition to that, continental drift produced even more changes in Earth's landscape, and that is kind of that process of these plates kind of drifting apart. So going from where we had one kind of cohesive continent to now where we have several different continents throughout the world. The other piece you want to keep in mind, my little disclaimer here at the bottom, is that not only do we react to changes in Earth's physical environments like mountain building and volcanic eruptions and changes in climate and weather patterns, we also shape our environments, right? Humans especially have a unique role in shaping our environment. So here is that those examples of these continental drift, right, of what's happened as part of that. So we've got the Carboniferous period, which is way back, right? The Triassic period. You would have the Jurassic period following that, the Cretaceous period, and then present day. And you can see how these continents have kind of shifted and started to kind of move apart as part of that process. So that has certainly changed what can survive where, just based on where these continents are found kind of globally. So that last little piece that I just added about humans and our impacts on our environments. Obviously, we also, and it's not just us, we tend to focus on us a lot, but there are lots of other living things that can also impact their environments by changing landscapes, right? By burrowing and digging holes, by humans cutting down trees, by altering the Earth's amount of greenhouse gases, which then leads to climate change and so on and so forth. So this is there's kind of really a balance here, right? We're dealing with not only changes occurring on the physical and chemical level that have nothing to do with living things, but then impact living things. And we're also dealing with changes that are kind of instituted and implemented by living things on that physical environment, which in turn also affect us, right? So it's kind of this give and take, and it just continuously is going to be happening, even if humans aren't here, right? All right, so that's what I've got here for 21. I think that was kind of lengthy, so I'm sorry about that. But go back, review if you need to. Make sure you've got your notes for this, and I will see you next time for 20.2. Bye, all.